Oh, no, away.
Good evening. Welcome to People's University Fairy Tales for Grown-Ups. Is everyone a grown-up in here? No, some people aren't. I know that. I saw it last week. Oh. If you wouldn't mind turning off your cell phones, please. Kids and your cell phones. Next Tuesday on the 8th of March, If These Walls Could Talk, revisiting the McClure Hotel. It will be Gene Finstein and a plethora of others. They will tell you about famous visitors to the McClure. You know the list. Buffalo Bill, Cody, Teddy Roosevelt, John Kennedy, Joe McCarthy, some famous, some infamous, etc., etc. That'll be Tuesday the 8th. And next week at this room at 7 p.m. on Thursday, March 10, bringing the fairy tale back to the horror realm, we'll have Professor Jessica McCourt in person. She teaches at Point Park University. Storyteller Rich Knoblich will be here. He's going to tell us Bluebeard, which is a shockingly horrific graphic tale, which I know is why you're here. And also to have a good time. We've been talking about the history and the art of storytelling. And we're honored to have with us tonight. Our guest is one of the best, if not the best, storyteller in our state, arguably much wider range than that. He's an award-winning storyteller, author, and recording artist, the host of History Channel's Man vs. History, the occasional host of NPR's internationally syndicated Mountain Stage, and a contributing columnist to the West Virginia Gazette Mail. His humorous tales and stories have earned the appreciation of listeners of all ages and from all walks of life. He's won the West Virginia Liars contest 5 times. Here's Bil Lepp.
Thank you so much for coming out. First thing I need to tell you is I am not an academic. I have not officially studied stories like in classrooms. However, I've been a professional full-time storyteller for the last 18 years. This has been my job, going all over the country telling stories, and I have listened to most of the best storytellers in the world over the course of that time and have gleaned an awful lot of information. So a lot of what I'm telling you tonight about fairy tales and folk tales and Appalachian tall tales, it's going to be the sort of progressive arc of this conversation, is my own opinion, but it's rooted in almost 20 years of paying attention. Most people don't believe I can pay attention for 20 minutes, but I can. So, as you already know from having been here before or having read the description, a lot of the fairy tales that we tell children now, that we grew up with ourselves, started out a lot more horrific than they are now. The classic example of that, if you, well, it doesn't matter if you've been through it or not, you're going through it again, is the Cinderella story. In the Cinderella story, when the prince comes to try the shoe on, the mother of the 2 stepsisters, so the stepmother of Cinderella, is so obsessed with the idea of her children becoming the princess that she cuts the front of one of their feet off so that it will fit in the shoe. And the prince notices when the blood starts to burble out that something is terribly wrong. And the other sister, because that ruse didn't work, she cuts off the back of her foot so that her foot will fit in the shoe. And then the prince notices when the blood starts to burble out. So these stories were incredibly graphic back when they were first put together. And an interesting thing about the Cinderella story that I'm just going to touch on for one quick second, Mary Hamilton, a storyteller out of Kentucky, did an awful lot of research on this, and there is a Cinderella story in, I'm not sure how many different cultures around the world, but as disconnected as the ancient peoples of Russia and the Navajo Nation in the southwestern part of the United States. So through all of those different cultures, seemingly unconnected cultures, they've all created one, or many of them have created one version of the Cinderella story or another. And what I think is interesting or indicative about the Cinderella story, which kind of gives an insight for me into how these fairy tales got started is back when these stories were being created, of course, most people couldn't read. In a lot of cases, there wasn't a written language at that point. So in order to pass on information from one generation to another, people figured out that if you put the information in a narrative, or whatever whether it's facts or a lesson that you're trying to teach, if you turn that into a story, it's easier for your audience to pay attention to that, and it's easier for them to retain that. So I think the Cinderella story came out of an era when, you had the feudal system in Europe. And if you weren't the aristocracy, if you weren't already rich, you were never going to be. There was no social mobility. In America, at least as long as I've been alive, and since before that, we tell our children, you can grow up and be anything you want to be. It doesn't matter what conditions you're born into, how poor you are, how terrible your neighborhood is, how awful the schools are. If you work hard, you can climb the social ladder and be anything you want. That wasn't true. Even 200 years ago, certainly 500 or 700 years ago, whenever the Cinderella story was written, there were very, very, very few rich people. They owned all the land. And if they were really generous, they let you work on their farm. And then they let you buy seeds and plant crops and tend those crops and harvest those crops and sell those crops. And if they were super, super nice, they let you keep some of the money from that whole output that you were doing. You weren't going anywhere in the world. But you can't, as a parent, I don't know how many of you are parents, but I have 2 children, and they're both almost 20 now. I could never find it in my heart to tell them what the feudal parents would have had to tell their children, which was no matter how hard you work, you're never going anywhere. Unless you happen to marry a prince, and the only way that's going to happen is if you get visited by a magic fairy god. So you can't tell your children there's no hope. The world is an awful place, and it's always going to be. So a story like Cinderella gets created so that you can tell your children that there is a glimmer of hope. There is a chance that you're going to get out of this terrible, terrible position and advance. Now, I've worked the caveat there is if you always work really hard and always do what you're told. Because that's what Cinderella does. No matter how terrible her conditions, she does the chores, she makes the dresses, she only complains to herself or to the mice or to the fairy godmother. She never complains out loud. So you can never go up against the system, but if you work really hard, you'll marry a prince. I've worked pretty hard my whole life. I like to think I've never even met a prince. So I don't know how true that is. So, that's kind of my theory. Again, I'm not an academic, but that's sort of my theory of where a lot of these stories came from. And then the great storyteller Donald Davis, okay, let me back up just a little bit. My least favorite fairy tale has always been, but even more so when I had children, has been Hansel and Gretel. Because first of all, when you think about fairy tales, how often is there a father in most of the fairy tales that we know? Where is the father in Cinderella? Where's the stepfather in Cinderella? Where's the father in the Little Red Riding Hood story? There's a father in, well, I guess there's a father in like The Little Mermaid, but that's Hans Christian Andersen, so that's a little bit later. There's a father in Beauty and the Beast. But in a lot of cases, the father is just absent in these stories. We just don't see the father. And I always thought, well, once I had children, I guess that's when that thought started to occur to me, is where is the dad in all of these stories? But in the Hansel and Gretel story, there is a dad. And I was like, ooh, there's a dad. Wait, he's the most awful father in all of fairy tales. His wife dies. He marries this evil stepmother. She doesn't like the children. She says, let's take them out in the woods and let them freeze to death or get eaten by wild animals. And his response to that is, okay. And he doesn't even put up a fight. Like I've never heard the dance version of that story. I've never heard like a 2-hour, but it doesn't sound like this guy puts up much of a fight. So I've always really disliked the Hansel and Gretel story. Now, there used to be a storytelling festival in Oklahoma, and 3 storytellers would be invited. And what we had to do was the 3 of us had to agree on one classic story, and we each then, in a concert, would present our own version of that story. And so the group I was with that year decided to do Hansel and Gretel. And I forget what I did, but I do know what Donald Davis said. He said he has also never liked that story. But he said the thing about fairy tales, a lot of fairy tales, is that they let us think about things that we don't say out loud. So as a parent, myself for sure, and probably you, if you're a parent or if you've been around small children, at some point you've thought, sort of harmlessly, but you thought it, I would like to take these children out in the woods and let them starve to death, right? I mean, it's come up. Somewhere along the line, you've had an awful thought. It doesn't have to be about your children, it can be about your spouse or your neighbor, whatever it is. So fairy tales give us an opportunity to sort of explore how that could happen. You know, what sort of, and so that's why, according to Donald Davis, there are some really dark things that come up in the fairy tales that we read, or that we know. And then there's other great examples, like the boogeyman. You know, we've all heard of the boogeyman. That comes out of the Grimm tales, as far as I understand. And in the old days, the boogeyman, you know, we say to our children, I don't know if we said it to your children, but I said it to mine, you don't go to bed, the boogeyman is going to come get you. Well, parents used to go into more depth, and the boogeyman would come, and if you weren't asleep in your bed, he had a giant pair of scissors, and he would cut off your fingers and toes. So go to bed and go to sleep, or the boogeyman is coming. Now, I don't know about you, but that would not help me go to sleep. So, obviously, these things got a little less brutal over time. And then, of course, when Disney came on the scene and they started making the Disney movies, they're not going to make a Cinderella cartoon where somebody's cutting off their feet or their sister's feet. So they did get cleaned up over time. But then, of course, there are lots of other sorts of stories that aren't quite fairy tales, but they still fall into the greater folklore genre. And that's really much more of my expertise, I guess. I am a humorous Appalachian tall tale teller. If you want to put that on a business card or explain it to the person sitting next to you on an airplane. So the tall tale is not exclusively an American form of story, but it is a form of story that is most closely associated with not just America, but with Appalachia. And the way we got to the tall tales that we have today, while the Cinderella story was being created, also in England, the Jack tales were being created. And the Jack tales are, the one that you can all name is Jack and the Beanstalk. In that story, here's poor Jack, and he goes out and he trades his cow for a couple of magic beans, and he comes home and he throws them out, or his mother throws them out in the yard, and then a giant beanstalk rises out of that. He climbs to the top of it. There's a castle in the sky, a giant's castle. Depending on how long the story you listen to, he outsmarts the giant on several occasions, steals all the gold, and the goose that lays the golden eggs, right? That's that same story. And then he cuts down the vine, and the giant dies. That's a pretty good outline of what most Jack stories do. And there are 1,000 Jack stories. And Jack is, you know, the difference between that Jack story and a lot of Jack stories. In a lot of Jack stories that you hear sort of in the storytelling folklore world, Jack also has 2 brothers. And they're both handsome and strong, and Jack is scrawny and sort of homely. And there'll be some sort of problem, whatever it is. The dragon is attacking the kingdom, the king's daughter won't laugh, and the king says, if you can make my daughter laugh, you can marry her and have my kingdom. The guy that thinks he threw his liver and his stomach up into the river, all kinds of crazy problems happen in the Jack stories. And The oldest brother goes out, because they're very poor, of course. The oldest brother goes out to try and solve the problem, to get the whatever reward to bring back to his family so they can eat. And almost invariably, he passes an old lady or an old man who says, I don't have anything to eat. And the brother does, in fact, have half a loaf of bread and an apple or some combination like that. And he says, sorry, old lady, you're out of luck. I'm on a mission. And then he goes and fails. And so then the next older brother goes out. And now he has a quarter loaf of bread and half an apple because they can't spare that much food anymore. And he passes the same old person who says, I'm hungry, I don't have anything to eat. And he's like, sorry, I'm on a mission, can't give you nothing. He fails. Jack goes out. Jack now has a crust of bread and a sliver of dried apple. He meets the hungry old person, and Jack says, well, I don't have much, but you can have half of what I have. And then that person gives Jack the magic staff, or the magic bag, or the magic stone, whatever the magic is, and that's what Jack needs to solve the problem. So obviously the first lesson of that story is, no matter how hard you have it, it's a good thing if you're generous with people who have less. That's a lesson that runs through the Jack stories that I think we miss a lot because we're looking, because that's usually very early in the story. And we've been attuned to find the lesson in a story at the end of the story. A lot of times somebody will say, and the moral of the story is, and it won't have anything to do with giving half your crust of bread to the hungry people. So then Jack goes out, and Jack's an idiot. Jack is not smart. That's always, the storyteller will always tell you that Jack is not smart. But Jack is persistent. And Jack isn't book smart, but Jack's pretty intelligent when it comes to dealing with people, which is how he knows to give half a crust of bread and a little bit of apple that he has. And so he just keeps trying. And he just keeps trying and trying and trying. And in the end, it works out. And the story where the king's daughter won't laugh, and if you can make her laugh, you get half the kingdom. What Jack's doing this whole time is he got a job and he earned $1. And so, no, wait a minute, that's not how it was. The people who he was working for, I forget what the first thing they give him is, but whatever it is, a jug of milk. And now I can't think what the first thing is. But let me just do it this way. At one point, he gets something, and his mother tells him to do something with it. I think it's butter. She tells him, and he puts it in his pocket, and by the time he gets home, it's melted. And so the next thing he gets is like a kitten. And so he thinks, well, I don't want it to melt. So she says, don't put it in your pocket, put it on your head. So he puts the cat on his head, and by the time he gets home, he's all torn up. And she says, no, don't put the cat on your head, put it on a leash. So the next thing he gets is a jug of milk. So he puts it on a leash, and he drags it home, and by the time he gets home, it's empty. And this just escalates until, I might be telling two different stories here, but at any rate, at one point, he has a donkey. And he knows that he's supposed to put, because whatever his mother told him last, he puts the donkey on his shoulders. And he's walking down the street carrying a donkey, and the princess looks out the window, and she thinks that's the most ridiculous thing she's ever seen in her life, and she starts to laugh. So the king calls in Jack. Jack gets to marry her. Jack also gets married at the end of almost every story that is in. And so I want some storyteller to tell a story how Jack gets arrested for polygamy. But the daughter laughs and has the donkey on his shoulder, so he gets half the kingdom. So it's through Jack's own idiocy that he always overcomes. I mean, there are some stories where Jack is smart or smarter than usual, but very often Jack is just relying on what he knew, and it's a train wreck when he applies it to the new situation, but somehow he makes it through. So those stories started in England or in the English Isles, I forget when, a long, long time ago. And then as the British and the English started to expand out into the world, as they became the enormous empire, the sun never set on the English flag, they were in India and Jamaica and Singapore, and then Australia and New Zealand, and what became the United States, and Canada, Haiti, everywhere the English went, they told these stories. Now, these were not the stories of the aristocracy. These were the stories of the poor. That's why Jack's poor and dumb, because all the soldiers in the British Army, not the generals, but the privates, were poor and dumb. That's how they ended up being, they didn't mean to be poor and dumb. They just were. They weren't stupid. They just didn't have a chance to get educated, except, through hard knocks. But they, as the folk, took those stories everywhere in the world. And who does a private who doesn't make any money in the British Army hang out with? He's not hanging out with the well-off people in the new country that they go to take over. He's hanging out with the riffraff. So the British soldiers start telling their stories to the local riffraff. They take the Jack stories, and then they twist them a little bit to fit their own culture, and then they become the folklore of that country as well. So the Jack stories have spread all over the world. Now, unlike the Cinderella story, I can trace how the Jack, I read it, I didn't do the research. I didn't find this out myself. So when we get to the United States, the English come to the United States, lots of people come to the United States, they bring the Jack stories with them. And then, of course, what happens in 1776, there's a little thing called the Revolutionary War, and a few years later, we separate from England. So now, especially along the east coast of the United States, along the Appalachian Mountains, which is just about as far as the country had expanded by that point, you have a lot of common ex-British, Scottish, Irish people who had grown up with Jack stories, but who now identified as Americans, who didn't have a king. So in the American versions of Jack stories, if you're going to take on the authorities, you're not taking on the king. So who's your closest sort of royal authority? The sheriff. So when Jack, in American Jack stories, goes up against the authorities, he's going up against the sheriff. So these stories, just like the fairy tale that evolved from cutting off people's feet to G-rated Disney movies, they evolve over time. And this is another reason why they're called folk stories, because they get in the hands or the mouths of the common people, and we work them so that they best match our lives. So that we can tell our children those stories that they can understand and pass on the message of those stories to the next generation. And hopefully that everybody's learning something from all of these stories. So the Jack tale sets the formula for the tall tale, because in the Jack stories, they're kind of a marriage. The Jack stories of a fairy tale and a tall tale, because there's the fairy tale element in a lot of Jack stories where he meets the hungry old lady who happens to also be a wizard and gives him the magic that he needs. Tall tales don't rely as much on magic. If you think of the story of Paul Bunyan, which isn't actually, if you watch my television show, Man vs. History on the History Channel, you know that it's not actually, it didn't actually come out of a folk tale, but it's more of an advertising campaign that got started later. But it got pulled from a bunch of different sources. But the American folktale characters that we have, Pecos Bill, Jack Frost, Paul Bunyan, I don't know, you can name some others. Johnny Appleseed. Well, but Johnny Appleseed and Davy Crockett, they were real people who sort of got fictionalized. But if you look at it, let me say it this way, the folktale characters that we have that represent a certain specific group of people. So Pecos Bill represents cowboys. Paul Bunyan represents loggers. Think about what happens in those stories. Who is Paul Bunyan? Paul Bunyan is a giant. He's a genius. He's exceptionally good looking. He can accomplish anything. And he's a logger, so he cuts down trees. And I think what happened with that Pecos Bill isn't a giant and he's not a genius, but he rides a mountain lion, he uses a rattlesnake for a lasso, and he eats dynamite. and he's a cowboy. So here are two groups of people. This, again, is not academic. This is how I envision this in my head. There's a guy from the Upper Peninsula in Michigan whose job it is to be a logger. And he goes to Chicago, and he's in a bar. And the person next to him says, what do you do? And he says, I cut down trees all day. You want to hear about that? And the person who asked him the question says, no, that sounds boring. Same thing with the cowboy. What do you do? Watch cows. You want to hear about that? No. So what do? You come up with a character who represents who you are, but in a fascinating and fantastic way. Paul Bunyan isn't just a logger. Now this guy can say, well, listen, I'm a logger, but let me tell you about this guy, Paul Bunyan. He's a giant. He's a genius. He has a frying pan so big that guys have to ride around on pats of butter to get it greased enough to make a flapjack as big as a pond. He created the Mississippi River by dragging his axe blade behind him, and then he cried so hard that's what filled it up with water. He's really good looking. Would you like to hear about that? Well, as a matter of fact, yes, that piqued my interest. So if you go and look, if you go upstairs in this library to, I believe it's the 800s, is it the 800s where folklore is? If you go to the 800s and find a book about Paul Bunyan, if you read that book from beginning to end, you will know how loggers cut down the trees, how they got them out of the woods, how they got them down the river, what they did with them once they got to the river, what they ate, what they wore, what shelters they lived in, what the weather was like. You will know absolutely everything there is to know about being a logger in, I don't know, 1850 in Minnesota or the Upper Peninsula of Michigan without anyone ever having told you you were learning something. And Pecos Bill does the same thing. Pecos Bill lets the cowboys talk about who they are through this other character who seems really exciting. So these folklore stories came out of this idea of being able to tell people who you were without really talking about yourself. And this is, when I was in college in my Appalachian sociology course with Dr. Carr at Wesleyan, one thing one of the few things I remember like explicitly from that course, I don't mean it's the only thing I remember, but I can just about quote Dr. Carr. Appalachians don't like it when you brag about the great things that you've done. So, I know we're up here at the very northern tip of Appalachia. Everybody likes to say this about West Virginia. People are like, what's the difference between northern West Virginia and southern West Virginia? And he says, northern West Virginia is Bruce Springsteen, and southern West Virginia is Loretta Lynn. And I think that really encapsulates it. But anyway, we don't like it. You probably don't like it. I don't like it. It doesn't really matter if you're Appalachian. Nobody likes to hear somebody else tell them about the great things that they've done. So how do you get around that? Well, look at the tall tales. You start to create something that represents what you are, but you never quite take credit for it. You can find that with the Jack tales. Jack's a moron who's just kind of bumbling through. And in a lot of tall tales and in a lot of folk tales, the hero who solves the problem at the end often creates the problem in the beginning. And it's just through their own will and determination to see the thing through that it gets solved at all. And, you know, I grew up in South Charleston, mostly Barber County, Fayette County, Upshur County. I grew up in some pretty heavily Appalachian areas. And I didn't know it when I was 20, but now that I look back on it, there was a lot of that going on. And so this is where the tall tale starts to come out. Let's say, you know, it's, I don't know, 1879. And there's three guys sitting on the front porch of the store. They got their feet up on the railing, and they all want to say how large of a pumpkin they grew. But they don't want to come out and say, I'm the world's greatest pumpkin grower. So the first guy says, well, I grew a pumpkin big enough that I carved it out and I use it as a doghouse now. And that's sort of fast. And, you know, it just happened to grow. And I was smart enough to see it was big enough to. And so the next guy, you know, well, mine was so big, I carved it out, I parked my wagon. And the third guy, mine is so big, I carved it out, put a second floor, we live in it. So this is where tall tales start to get their genesis. You know, you probably all have heard the story where the guy has the axe handle and it gets bit by a rattlesnake. Like he's about to get bit by a rattlesnake because he's doing something dumb. And to keep from getting bitten by the rattlesnake, he sticks his axe handle out, and the snake bites the axe handle. And when he goes out the next morning, it's swollen up so big that it's a log that he carves into a house. That he makes boards out of, enough to build a house. Plus, there's enough extra lumber that he sells it and makes a fortune. And then, of course, everything shrinks back. When the swelling goes down, but he still has the money. So it's not his fault that this happened. He just did what any of us would have done. He put the axe handle between himself and the rattlesnake, and then he just happened, out of this accident, to have enough sense to build a house and make a fortune, and then it all goes away. So this is where these tall tales start to come from. They come from this Jack who's kind of a moron, but it's also this urge to tell people about who we are without bragging too much about who we are. So these things just happen to us, and we just happen to have a way to get out of them that works. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you a story, and then we'll spend, it'll take 15 minutes or so, and then we can spend the last couple of minutes. I know I talk really fast, and I'm sorry, but at least I'm loud. So it doesn't seem like I want questions, but I'm certainly open to questions. So I'll tell you a story, and then, just say a few redundant things about how hopefully that reflects on what I've been talking about. And then we can have a little Q&A. So this is actually my brother Paul wrote this story. The Liars Contest, let me just say this. The Liars Contest is part of the Vandalia Gathering, which is a celebration of traditional Appalachian arts and culture that goes down at the Capitol every year since, 50 or 60 years, except, of course, minus Corona. And it is primarily a music festival with banjo contest. Was it? Probably. Yeah, hopefully. But it's banjo contest, fiddle contest, pie cooking contest, quilting contest, Appalachian arts. In 1983, Dr. Ken Sullivan, who at that time was editor of Goldenseal magazine, thought that he should start a storytelling contest at the Vandalia Gathering to perpetuate the art of storytelling and oral history in Appalachian culture. But he knew, because he was a smart man, that if he called it a storytelling contest, nobody would come. Because, again, this has been my full-time job for 20 years, and I still, every day, when I tell people I'm a storyteller, they think I read books to children. And that's not what I do. I tell adult stories. I don't tell adult stories, but I tell stories that are written for adults. So Ken called it the Liars Contest, because that's interesting. Just like Paul Bunyan is more interesting than your average logger. Also, no offense if you're a logger. So he called it the Liars Contest. That started in 1983. The first 3 years, the people that won, it's the most objective contest you'll ever do. There are like 5 rules, but if you're entertaining, they don't necessarily apply to you. They're there in case you're bored, and then we can jerk you off the stage. But the first 3 years, like a guy from Maine, Tom Drummond, I think his name was, nothing against Tom Drummond, but he told Maine tall tales, and he won. And other people told stories from other places. In 1983 or 1986, my brother Paul, who has since passed on, he entered the Liars Contest. He told a story. You probably remember when the airplane wrecked. In fact, this has been the anniversary, so you almost certainly remember. The airplane wrecked at the Yeager Airport, and it was carrying like 5 tons of marijuana. And then the police, to get rid of it, burned it. And the airport sits up above Charleston, and the prevailing winds just brought it all down. So my brother, the first year, wrote the story where he was fishing on the Kanawha River, and he accidentally snagged the airplane with his fishing line because it was flying really low. And so then he was stuck to the airplane, and so he eventually makes it crash. And at that point, the story started to be more West Virginia centric. And the next year, he told this story. And after that, I don't think anybody's won the Liars Contest since 1986 whose story was not set in West Virginia. So it became a very West Virginia-centric storytelling contest. And then, again, Ken Sullivan's original idea was to perpetuate and promote the art of storytelling in West Virginia and Appalachia. The National Storytelling Festival is the Broadway of storytelling. It's in Jonesboro, Tennessee every year, first full weekend in October. 30 storytellers come, 15,000 people come from around the world. There's 6 tents that seat 2,000 people each. They're packed from Friday morning to Sunday afternoon. I was the first West Virginian to be invited to the National Storytelling Festival, and it's all because of the Liars Contest. And since then, I think 4 graduates of the Liars Contest have been featured tellers at the National. In fact, nobody, I don't think, who's been featured at the National Storytelling Festival from West Virginia has not been involved in the Liars Contest. So as far as starting a whole contest, it really worked. But anyway, it's my brother Paul's story. You probably heard it because he's really old. There stands a bridge in Fayette County, West Virginia. It's the longest single-span arch bridge in the world and the second tallest bridge in North America. It's called the New River Gorge Bridge, and if you've never been to see it, you owe yourself a trip because it's quite a sight. But I am speaking from experience when I tell you that you should never, ever, for any reason, stop in the middle of that bridge. You see, it was the second Saturday in May. I had just woken up. There was no particular significance to the day, except that I realized that it was already May, and I had yet to go fishing that entire year. So I figured I owed myself a trip down to the Marmot Locks to do a little carp fishing. So I threw all my gear in my car, the Great Golden Carp Cruiser, the GC for short, and I headed out. Now, I only had $5 in my pocket, so when I stopped at the local 7-Eleven, I bought the cheapest 6-pack of soda that I could find, a couple of Slim Jims, and a can of green giant corn for the car. Well, that left me with $1. I decided I was going to buy one of those scratch-off lottery tickets, and folks, it was my lucky day. That ticket was worth $1,000. Now, I looked at that ticket, and right away, I knew there was just one of 2 things I could do with that ticket. I could either take that ticket home, give it to my wife, and never see a penny of that money again. Or I could cash that ticket, spend whatever I wanted to, and tell her I won whatever was left over. Well, I cashed that ticket quicker than a Confederate dollar at Appomattox. That joke's funny when the further north you go. That cashier counted out 1,000 crisp new $1 bills. I put $20 worth of gas in the Great Golden Carp Cruiser, which was a lot of gas when this story was written. And I headed out to see wild, wonderful West Virginia with 980 crisp new $1 bills in my pocket. But this is where that bridge comes back into the story. Because you see, I got about a quarter way across that bridge when I started hearing the ominous thump, thump, thump of a flat tire. Well, a flat's a flat, and there's nothing you can do to fix it. So I coasted to a stop, dead in the middle of that bridge. And I can tell you right now that sooner or later, I'm going to buy a tire iron for that car. Because by the time I got those lug nuts off with a pair of channel locks, I was hot, tired, and mad. I was so mad that when I reached into the trunk and pulled out the spare tire, I just threw it down on the bridge as hard as I could. Well, that tire bounced. It bounced about 20 feet up into the air. Came down about 2 feet from the edge of that bridge, which would have been just fine, except that it was the wrong 2 feet. I took a step over to the edge of that bridge, and I watched as that tire fell 864 feet clear down to the New River, where it bounced twice and landed standing upright in 3 feet of water. Well, I looked a quarter mile to my right, 864 feet down the bank, and I looked a quarter mile to my left, and 864 feet down the bank. I did some quick ciphering, and I figured out that it was going to take me anywhere from 3 hours to 6 days to hike down there and get my tire. But that's about the time I remembered the monster stick. Now, the monster stick is my 9-foot surf casting rod, complete with 6 miles of brand new 50-pound test strand hardcore. And it occurred to me that I could simply tie a hook to the end of that line, lower it down, snag my tire, and bring it back up without ever taking a step. Well, I started to feel good again then. But I think it was probably the same sort of good feeling that John Brown had just before he put his Harper's Ferry plan into action. As you see, everything went fine for about the first 500 feet. And then the biggest red bird I'd ever seen spotted that hook, mistook it for a descending spider, swooped in, swallowed it whole, and landed in a rhododendron bush up on the shore. Well, I looked at that bird, and I thought about my mother, and I tried to gently coax that bird out of that rhododendron bush. When that didn't work, I started thinking about my West Virginia state income tax return. And how every year I checked that box to donate $1 to the non-game wildlife fund. I said to myself, Bill, you bought that bird. You're going to have to do what you have to do. And I hauled back on the monster stick just as hard as I could. And that rhododendron bush barely erupted in a mushroom cloud of crimson feathers and red petals. And that entire blob was headed on a perfect trajectory straight for my tire when lightning struck twice. You see, a 4-foot brook trout spotted that blob, mistook it for his fly of the month subscription, came out of the water, swallowed that whole thing, dove back into the water, swam upstream right through the hole in the middle of my tire, hit his head on a rock, did a somersault, and landed up on shore. Well, I just stood there watching, see what was going to happen next. And sure enough, before long, the old black bear came out of the woods. He sniffed that fish a couple of times, and then he swallowed it whole. Well, I started to feel good again, because I knew nothing in the air, nothing in the water, and nothing in the woods was going to come and eat that bear. So I just started reeling. I reeled that bear off the shore and into the water. I reeled him downstream until his head went right through the hole in the middle of my tire. And I just started reeling up until the tire settled over his shoulders, and I just reeled and reeled and reeled. Well, after a while, I heard a voice behind me. Now, mind you, this was no ordinary voice. This was like when the loudspeaker goes off in school and says, "Bil Lepp, please come to the office." And that fella, he said to me, he said, "Son, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm trying to get my tire back." He said, "It looks to me like you're fishing." And I think it's safe to say that fellow wasn't mighty surprised when he took a step to the edge of that bridge, looked down, and saw what I was bringing up. I think it's safe to say I was a mite surprised as well, though, because as it turns out, he was a state game warden. Well, I didn't know what else to do except to keep on reeling. So I reeled that whole mess up to the edge of the bridge, and I just kind of lifted it up over. That bear just lay there. Most of the fight had gone out of him about 500 feet. That officer, he looked at that and he said, "Son, I don't know why you did this. I don't care to know why you did this, but I can tell you you're in a heap of trouble." And he reached in his back pocket and pulled out his pencil. He reached in his front pocket. He reached in his back pocket. I haven't had a full story for 2 years. He reached in his back pocket, pulled out his notepad. He reached in his front pocket, pulled out his pencil. It wouldn't have mattered if I said it the other way, but I just can't do it. And he commenced to write. And he wrote, pausing only long enough to ask me my name, date of birth, social security number, home address, that sort of thing. Every now and again, he'd flip the page and carry a number. And when he was finally done writing, he said to me, "Son," he said, "do you see that bear right there?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "That's a black bear." He said, "That's the state animal of the great state of West Virginia. Would you have taken illegally out of season without a permit? That's a $500 fine." He said, "Do you see that fish sticking out of that bear's mouth?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "That's a brook trout." He said, "That's the state fish of the great state of West Virginia, but you have taken from a no-fishing zone using illegally obtained bait. That's a $100 fine." He said, "Do you see that bird sticking out of that fish's mouth?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "That's a cardinal. That's the state bird of the great state of West Virginia. That's a non-game bird that you have taken from a federally protected bird sanctuary. That's a $100 fine." He said, "Do you see those flowers sticking out of that bird's beak?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Those are rhododendron flowers, son. That's the state flower of the great state of West Virginia, but you have taken from a national no flower picking zone. That's a $50 fine." He said, "Do you see that tire around that bear's neck?" I just sort of nodded my head. He said, "That tire constitutes litter." He said, "That litter which you've caused to be thrown into a national scenic waterway, that's a $200 fine." He said, "Those fines in aggregate shall total $950. payable in cash on the spot right now, or you can opt for legal confinement until such payment is made. Well, he looked at me in my old blue jeans and the great golden cart cruiser kind of teetering on 3 wheels, and he said, "You look like the kind that's going to opt for legal confinement." Well, he was already looking at me like I was crazy. So when I reached in my pocket, he went for his gun. And I just pulled out that wad of 980 crisp new dollar bills, and I counted out 950 of them for him. And he was so pleased with that he introduced me to his brother-in-law, who fixed my flat tire for the amazing low price of $28. Now, as I was heading home, I was thinking to myself that if every fishing trip was going to be that expensive, I wasn't going to be able to go all that often. But then I started thinking about my wife. Well, I've told you people this story, and I'm sure you believe every word of it. But my wife, she's the suspicious type. And I know if I'd gone in with this tale, she wouldn't have believed one word of it. So even though it's against my grain, I decided I was going to have to lie to her. When I walked in the door, she said, "How'd it go?" I said, "It went just fine." And as I was leaving the room, I reached in my pocket, pulled out those last 2 crisp $1 bills, and I said, "Oh yeah, I almost forgot. I won this for you in the lottery today." So when my brother wrote that story, and my biggest influence was him, when I started writing my stories, I didn't know that we were writing Appalachian tall tales the way we were because we'd been influenced by hearing Appalachian tall tales and a lot of reading Mark Twain, who is just on the other side of Mississippi. So that's just about Appalachian. Mark Twain's work has a lot to do with Appalachian tall tales and certainly American folklore. I don't mean that it is American folklore. I mean also that it is based on American folklore. But my brother and I had just heard stories like that our whole life. So when we sat down to write stories, that's just naturally the form that we wrote them in, which worked out really well for me because when I came onto the storytelling scene, nobody else was doing what I was doing, so there was a niche for me. But if you look at that story, it's very much like the Jack Tales. My brother's an idiot, no offense. He goes to do something normal, go fishing. He only has $5, and so he buys a lottery ticket on a whim. That turns into $1,000. He then does a series of stupid things that both create and solve problems simultaneously, and with a lot of good tall tales, they just grow exponentially. We start out, he pops a tire, it goes off the bridge through his own fault. He then accidentally catches a bird, which catches a fish, which catches a bear, which catches the tire, which catches the police. And then the fortune that he made disappears and ends up being $2. All because of both his smarts and his dumbs. So it's kind of a bragging story. I managed to solve this problem by doing it this way, but it's also a humility story because in the end, I'm just in the same place that I was to begin with. And that is one of the absolute, I think it is the most important thing, no matter what kind of stories you tell. You can never, ever, ever be the hero of your own story. Now, most of the stories I tell in the first person. I have a character named I. My brother told that story in the first person. So I went fishing, I lost my tire, I caught the bear. The stories are about me. There's no doubt about it. But I'm never the hero. I am sort of in a subgenre, but I'm not bragging. I'm just a moron. And I do things, I bumble along just like Jack until hopefully they turn out well. If something really heroic happens in one of my stories, and I've got hundreds of stories, it's me witnessing someone else doing something heroic. If I write almost all of my own stories, and if I want to write about something heroic, it's me seeing someone else doing something heroic. Because just think about it, you go out to dinner with somebody, you go to a family reunion, whatever, you constantly run into people who want to tell you how great they are. And if that person is here, don't look right at but as soon as somebody starts telling you how great they are, unless you're weird, your brain tunes out. You don't hear that. So your stories can't be about how great you were. They have to be about how much of an idiot you are, so you're hiding your genius and your idiocy, or you saw something great happen. And just real quick, just to give you an idea of the stories that I tell. Well, let me say this also. My brother has the monster stick. In almost all of his stories, the monster stick makes an appearance. This 9-foot surf casting rod with 6 miles of brand new 50 contest brand cardboard. The monster stick, and I have in a lot of my tall tale stories, not my skeeter stories, I have my 74 function Swiss Army type knife that has a sewing machine, just for example, a sewing machine, grappling hook, a copy of the New Testament, preaching vestments. So the monster stick and my pocket knife are the magic that the little old lady gives to Jack. Because through the monster stick and through my pocket knife, anything is possible. In fact, the way I figured that little fact out is I was reading The Tempest. People would tell you, I love Shakespeare. I tried it. I'm pretty dyslexic. It was hard. But in The Tempest, there's the muses. When things get bad, I think the muses show up, and they're little magic ladies who make stuff happen. And I was telling my buddy, who's a super duper Shakespeare guy, I was like, I don't get this. The muses, I'm like, this isn't real. This isn't real life. How can you just have somebody magic show up, and then when you're in a problem, and they just take care of everything? And he said, well, what's your pocket knife do in all of your stories? And I was like, shut up. So I do have these little magic things in my stories. But also a lot of my stories are about me and my buddy Skeeter. The first Skeeter story, and almost all of them are based on something me and my buddies did or thought about doing in junior high or high school, because, back it up, all of my stories are about something stupid I did, and junior high and high school students are the epicenter of dumb. In the very first Skeeter story, Skeeter shows up at my house. It's the night before buck season, and he has made 2 deer masks and taken a mannequin and dressed it in hunter's orange. And he has tied that mannequin to the hood of his truck. And we are going to drive around town like it's people season, and we got one. And things go badly from that point on. So that was the original Skeeter story, and that's based on my buddy James Long. When I lived in Martin County, he showed up at my house and he was like, we should do this. And I was like, okay. And we got in the truck. And then I was like, Jay, we live in Martin County, West Virginia. If we drive a truck dressed like deer with a guy tied to the hood, somebody on their front porch is going to be like, shoot them deer. So I didn't do it. But then, so created this character, Skeeter. Skeeter is based on my best friend. But I didn't meet the person who is Skeeter until I was 25 years old. So I took this character, Skeeter, and I went back in history and invented our childhood so that we could lie to our children about what we did when we were their age. But one of the reasons Skeeter is in my stories is because a lot of dumb stuff happens. Almost too much dumb stuff for one person to think of in a lifetime. So I have Skeeter there to also think of bad ideas. Skeeter's usually the generator of the bad ideas, which is interesting, because I tell those stories and I meet people and they say, my brother Tom was Skeeter, or my best friend Jane was Skeeter. Nobody is ever Skeeter. Nobody says, I was Skeeter. So then Skeeter and I have created this entire universe that Skeeter and I live in. We live in a little town called Half Dollar, West Virginia. It's a little tiny town. We have 2 streets. One's called Main Street. The other one's called, no, that ain't Main Street. And then from there, I've just created this entire universe of things that happen to us. Most of them, many of them, based on little tiny incidents that happened at some point in my life, and it's worked out. I've been making a living. When I say I'm a full-time storyteller, that's it. That's been my whole job, just about. Well, my daughter's 18, so it's been 18 years. Okay, I've talked a long time. Oh, they're so long. Let me think of a quick Skeeter story. No, he's not in that. I mean, he's in it, but he's not in that part of it. Let me go look over here at my stuff. Maybe I'll think of one just by looking. Okay, Skeeter, this is more about my grandfather, but Skeeter's in it. So, my grandfather in real life lied to me all the time, but it was a good lie. You should lie to your children. You should lie to your grandchildren. Because, well, you'll see why. So we called him Großpapa because German for a great father. It has nothing to do with his personal life. So after a really long story, we go to Maine, Islesboro, Maine, for summer vacation. And Skeeter and I get out of the car and we go running down to the ocean. And we dive in the ocean. We're like 7 years old. Just me and Skeeter go down the ocean alone. No adults there. Because safety hadn't been invented yet. So I'm running into the North Atlantic Ocean. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in the North Atlantic Ocean, but even in August, it's cold. So we turn around, we came running back out of the ocean. Großpapa said, "Is it cold?" And Skeeter said, "Yes." And Großpapa said, "Well, you have to acclimate yourselves." And we said, "How do you acclimate yourself?" And Großpapa said, "You have to put your entire body underwater." So Skeeter and I ran back out into the ocean, and we dove down, and we popped back up, and we came back. And Großpapa said, "Are you acclimated?" And Skeeter said, "I don't think so." And Großpapa said, "Well, did you open your eyes?" And we said, "No." And Großpapa said, "Well, you have to open your eyes." So Skeeter and I went running back out into the North Atlantic Ocean, dove down, opened our eyes, popped back out, came back. Großpapa said, "Are you acclimated?" And we said, "I don't know." And he said, "Did you open your eyes?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "What happened?" And I said, "It burned." And Großpapa said, "That's because it's salt water." And Skeeter said, "It was dark." And Großpapa said, "Do you know why it was dark?" And we said, "No." And he said, "Because the sunlight can only penetrate so deep into the ocean." He said, "The deeper you go, the darker it gets. Until you get down way deep in the ocean, there's no sunlight, there's no light whatsoever. And the sea creatures that live down there have to generate their own light. They are bioluminescent creatures, just like fireflies." He said, "There's a fish called the lampfish. It has a lamppost sticking right out of the middle of its forehead, got a little light on the end of it so you can see where it's going." And we said, "How deep down?" No, wait. And then he said, the light can only penetrate so far. And this is up where they started in a different way. He said, the light can only go down so far, so when you get down deep, it's dark. And I said, "Wait a minute, that's not true, because I can see all the way to the bottom of the deep end at the swimming pool." Großpapa said, "That's because that's fresh water, but this is salt water. And salt water is more buoyant, so the light can't penetrate as deep, because it's light. So it floats." And then he told us about the lampfish. And we said, "How deep down are these lanternfish?" And Großpapa said, "Deep, probably 6, 7 feet." And so Skeeter and I went running back into the North Atlantic Ocean, dove down to the bottom, opened our eyes in the burning salt water, grabbed hold of rocks so that we couldn't float to the surface, and lay there underwater, holding our breath, 5 feet down, waiting for a lanternfish to come by. And when we were about dead, we left the water. And this, by the way, is why you should lie to children, because a quality lying adult can, get a child, manipulate a child to have fun, even in the most miserable situations. So we came back out, and we were little. We were tiny little children. I did not break 100 pounds or 6 feet tall until I was a junior in high school. So we're standing there shivering. I could die of hypothermia, standing in the middle of the Sahara Desert at noon, holding a cold drink. And after like 5 minutes, Großpapa said, "Are you feeling warmer?" And Skeeter said, "Yes." And Großpapa said, "Uh-oh." And Skeeter said, "What do you mean, uh-oh?" And Großpapa said, "Well, they say you start to feel warm just before you freeze to death." So it's part of a much larger, it's part of a 30-minute story, but there's your little explanation. All right, what else you got? Other questions? Yes.
What was it like, you and your brother in the house, for your mother?
Well, he said, "What was it like for you, for your mother, with you and your brother in the house?" My brother Paul was 10 years older than I was. Let me just start here. It's a long story. My family, my mother and father, went from being a single child family to a 5-child family in a year. They had my brother Paul, like, you know, the way you have children. And then they didn't think they could have any more biological children. They lived out in the middle of nowhere. So they wanted to adopt a brother for my brother Paul, who was about the same age, so that he would have someone to play with. So that was Kevin. And as they were signing the papers to adopt Kevin, this is true, by the way, as they were signing the papers to adopt Kevin, the counselor mentioned that Kevin also had a sister. And my parents were like, well, should have told us that before, and I'm going to split them up. So they adopted my sister Katie, or my sister Tammy. At the same time, they adopted my brother Kevin. They were like 6 and 7. I don't know, I wasn't there. And then they wanted a baby. So they adopted my sister Katie within like a 9-month period. And then they found out they were pregnant with me. So my mom's life was already crazy. So Paul was 10 years older than me, and Paul and Kevin, let's just say this, they carved a very broad path for me as a child. If I was not brought home by the police, I probably wasn't in trouble. So they had already caused a lot of problems, but I was a perfect child, is what I'm trying to avoid. But yeah, my dad especially is very proud that his 2 sons are the 11-time champions of the West Virginia Liars Contest, and my children have both won the Liars Contest. We're the only family actively bringing up our children to be better liars. Nothing else? We're just going to stare at each other.
When's the national?
The National Festival is the first full weekend in October.
Are you going?
Yes. There's also a really nice storytelling festival that's a little bit closer in Cave Run. Well, it's in Moorhead, Kentucky, which is, well, I don't know what it is, but it's closer to the National Festival. It's the weekend, it's like the last weekend in September, and it's in a tent that's maybe twice the size of this room with 1,000 people, but it's just one tent, and you don't have to move around. The tellers come to the stage just one after another from Friday morning to Saturday night, and so you stay where you are, and there's great food at the Cave Room Story. Yes?
If you are interested in joining or participating in this contest, how do you do that?
The Liars Contest?
Yeah.
It is so easy. You show up on the day of the event, and as long as you sign up 5 minutes before it's over, you're in the contest. There's no, what do you call it? There's no, jury, right? There's no jury. You just show up. You can sign up. I'm serious. You can sign up while the contest is going on. It's better, I think, to start writing your story, earlier than that, because we usually get like 20 people. I've been a judge for a long time, we usually get like 20 people at the Liars Contest, and there are 3 distinct classes of people. There are people who thought about being in the Liars Contest 2 weeks before and did some prep work. And there are people who, generally finish first, second, and third, who started thinking of a story maybe in January or March and have been working on it it's the last weekend in May. So they've been working on it for several months. And then there are the people who, sitting in the audience, thought, oh, I could tell something. And they're the people who the rules are. But you won $100. The prize has not gone up since 1983. And you also win a golden barn shovel. But if you look up the Bandana Gathering, you just the West Virginia Liars Contest, it'll give you the information. Yes?
Have you met or ever competed with Harry Light?
Harry Light, the former pastor? Yeah, my dad's a Methodist pastor. They were real good friends.
They lived here a long time.
Yeah, because he was bishop, right? Or no, he was just really important. Yeah, he and my parents, they went to the National Strike. So many better.
What are the rules?
For the Liars Contest? Well, your story can't be more than 5 minutes long. I think they extended that to 7. But again, if you're entertaining, go a little long. It's got to be clean. That might be it. And then you're judged on creativity, originality, which is the difference there is some people tell stories, traditional stories that have already existed, or jokes that they expanded in the story, but are you telling it in a new way? I don't know, there's 5 categories. And they're like, are you funny? That's basically the whole contest. Again, it's the most subjective thing you'll ever encounter. The ego getting cane.
How do you get the History Channel gig?
How to get the History Channel gig?
I was gonna ask that.
Well,
Did that come from you telling stories and that's why you try to debunk the stuff?
I would-
you try to debunk and-
like the characters in my stories and my folk tales, I just kind of bumble through life. I work hard and then things happen. It's really fortunate. So this guy named Sam, whose job it is to invent television shows. He lives out in Hollywood. He thinks of TV shows. He goes to the A&E headquarters, the History Channel headquarters, and he says, here's the TV show I thought of. And they say, no, we hate it, or, here's $20,000. Go shoot me a 15-minute episode. Bring it back. If we like it, we'll give you more money. So that's Sam's job. He was going to do a show, I think, on moonshiners. And so naturally, he typed in West Virginia. And when he typed in West Virginia, my name came up. And so he refocused his idea, and his original idea was to do a show on the truth or the history behind folk tales. So I don't know if you saw the show ever, but the first episode, we look into the facts of the John Henry story and the Johnny Appleseed story, as well as Paul Bunyan as well. And so we went down to the tunnel in Talbot, and we talked to the locals about whether John Henry lived there. We went to a tunnel in Virginia and talked to the locals about whether, or talked to a scholar about whether it happened there. And we went, we just dug into the history. So that was the original idea, but the History Channel wasn't crazy about that. So they said, we still like me, so come up with a different concept. So Sam came up with an idea where we would tell 3 stories in one show, 2 which would be true, and 1 which I would make up. And so I went out to Hollywood and I shot that, and the first 2 stories were true, or they were stories that are supposed to be true. The glowing soldiers of Shiloh, there's this myth that during the Battle of Shiloh, the wounded were laying in the swamps and this bacteria got in them, and the bacteria started to glow. And so and it also had healing aspects to it. And so these soldiers on the battlefield started walking back to the hospital, and they were glowing. You can look it up on the internet. It's called Glowing Soldiers of Shiloh. And then I forget what the second one was that was true, but then the one I made up was that there were these 2 guys in what would become the eastern panhandle of Virginia, like over towards Gettysburg, Harpers Ferry. And they were famous moonshiners in the area. And so when the armies in the north and the armies in the south came to fight the Civil War, they conscripted everybody except these 2 guys, because both sides knew that they were the best moonshiners in the world, and they didn't want them to get killed. So their spirit was more important to the war than their bodies, is what I said. So we shot that, and they didn't like that, but they still liked me. So then they came up with the idea of what became Man versus History, where I look into the facts behind a lot of things that we think we know are true. Like who the first person to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel was. Did Spencer, Mr. Spencer, really show up at the White House with a rifle, go into the Oval Office, drop it on the desk, and say to Abe Lincoln, here's a repeating rifle, and Abe Lincoln said, great, let's go out to the backyard and shoot. Is that true? Tune in and find out. And you can, it's not on TV anymore because it didn't get picked up for a second season, the reason I did. But if you go to the History Channel, you can find it and you can watch it, as well as on things like Amazon and Google. So that is the long answer to how that show happened. Yes?
So how has lying served you in life? How would you? What your kids can tell you? No?
Yeah, I'm really a bad liar. My wife will tell you. I'm not good at deceiving people. I mean, I can do it in a jam, but I don't, I'm a pretty honest person, which I think is why it works for me well on stage. But it was funny when my children were growing up. My son is older than my daughter, And one time I remember clearly, I was out of the room and she all of a sudden started crying. And I ran in the room and I said to my son, "Why is your sister crying?" And he said, "I hit her." And part of me was like, come on, think of something better to say than that, right? So part of me wanted him to come up with a much more colorful answer. And part of me was like, don't hit your sister. I'm glad you told the truth. So I was a minister for a while, and I think it made my sermons more interesting. And a lot of the storytellers on the circuit have some sort of ministerial past. It's just interesting. But I think it's because, especially in the New Testament or the Synoptic Gospels, anyway, a lot of that is story. Think of the parables that Jesus tells. A lot of the stories that many of us grew up listening to. Of course, in the Jewish culture, they got so much better stories in the Jewish culture. And there's several prominent Jewish storytellers. So, I think also having a religious past. I'm sure every religion has good stories. Well, not the religions that don't have that. But the ones that have good stories stick around, right? So we get influenced by that. And I remember learning, and I was already doing the Liars contest when I went to divinity school. But my professor, I had this really great professor who was really good about explaining how your congregation has heard these stories so many times that if you get up and say, "I'm going to preach on the parable of the lost son," you as the congregation just tune in. You've heard it. You don't want to hear it again. You know what happened. So you have to come at it from a creative direction. And he played us this story, a sermon that another preacher preached, from the perspective of the older son. And I don't remember the whole thing, but I remember at the end, the young son comes back, and the father says to the older son, "Go and kill the fatted calf. We're going to have a feast because my lost son came back." And in this version, the older son goes, "What? That is my prize for each calf. I'm not killing that." So that was a moment that I remember of how to tell familiar stories from a different direction. And when you start to tell them from a different direction, people find a new way into them. So I don't tell a lot of stories that aren't original. But even when I tell my own original stories, but especially if I'm going to tell a story that's traditional, I do try and find a new way into it so that you don't think you're hearing the same old thing. For example, my book, which I have 2 copies of, is The Princess and the Pickup Truck. And that came from, I was driving with my daughter, and there was a pickup truck in front of us, and it just had like 15 mattresses thrown in the back. You live in West Virginia, you know. And I said to my daughter, who is the single funniest person in the world, I'm not kidding. That's one thing that storytelling has done for me. My children have been going to storytelling festivals since they were big babies. They're incredibly funny. When it comes to like an ACT test, when reading comprehension, they top out. And they have incredible vocabularies because they've heard the greatest storytellers telling stories their entire life. But I said to my daughter, "Could you sleep on that, to these mattresses?" And she said in the back seat, "Of course I could, I'm a princess." And that reminded me of The Princess and the Pea. So I went home and I wrote this story, The Princess and the Pickup Truck. It is an Appalachian take on The Princess and the Pea. Not going to spoil too much for you, but when she shows up and the mom and the son decide to see if she's a real princess, they have her sleep on 20 mattresses piled up on top of a pickup truck. And they know that if she doesn't notice the pickup truck, she's a real mountain princess. So, yeah. All right, thank you guys. I'm going to say one more thing if I may. That was the entertainment portion. This will be the commercial. This is my full-time job. The world is hopefully opening back up again. If you need a speaker and you have money, I'm your guy. You can find me on the internet at leppstorytelling.com. That's Lepp storytelling.com. If you just type in Bil Lepp, I'm usually the first thing that comes up. And I do have some of my CDs, if you remember those, and have a CD player, and also some collections on USBs that you can plug into your computer or your car. And then, of course, 2 copies of my book. But thank you guys very much. It's been a pleasure to be out here. I'm so excited to be back out in the world in front of live audiences. Thank you guys for showing up.
Thanks.